Good morning. Today I would like to talk about George Washington. George Washington, who served as president of the Constitutional Convention, and George Washington, who led America's revolutionary war forces. I mean, if his career had ended there, he would have gone down in American history as one of the more extraordinary men in American history. Yet each of us know that that's not where his service will in fact end. George Washington will become the first president of this new nation. Today what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about President Washington's first term in office, specifically emphasizing the precedents that he will establish and the challenges that the man encountered in establishing and setting forth this new nation. Washington was elected unanimously by the Electoral College in 1789. And while the experience of being chosen to be America's first president was in fact exhilarating, it was a triumphant experience, the days that followed being elected will be anything but triumphant. Washington was in fact a very wealthy man, but his wealth was tied up in real estate. Washington owned a lot of land in places like Western Virginia, for example, and he did not have liquid capital. And so in order for Washington to travel via carriage to the temporary capital at New York City, he's going to have to secure a loan from one of his neighbors. One of his neighbors will float him a loan in order to pay for his transportation to New York City. This is going to be a humiliating experience for George Washington, being forced to secure a loan. I mean, the sting of that humiliation is going to be with him in the days that followed. But the sting of that humiliation will quickly disappear as Washington sets forth to head from Mount Vernon to New York City. The American people will come forward to meet their new president, to get a glimpse of this revolutionary war hero. Washington was in fact an American hero. He was an American icon, and people came out and hoping to catch a glimpse of this great man. As Washington traveled from place to place, there will be thousands that will meet and greet him. Once he crossed the state line into Pennsylvania, the governor of Pennsylvania was there. And the governor of Pennsylvania will in fact give Washington an escort with full military honors. He will escort Washington into Philadelphia. And in Philadelphia, Washington will be greeted with parades. Bells will be ringing. It's going to be a magnificent affair. Every place that he goes, from Philadelphia to Baltimore to Trenton, he's going to be greeted with pomp and pageantry, and the ceremony that was granted to this man for being selected as America's first president. Once Washington arrives in Manhattan, astonishingly, he's going to be greeted by 30,000 Americans. 30,000 people gathering to catch a glimpse of Washington in Manhattan. That's a sizable crowd by 18th century standards. The sting of being forced to secure a loan from one of his neighbors was quickly overridden. For Washington, who had long desired this, had won the acclaim of his countrymen. Washington recognized the importance of being first He recognized the significance of being chosen the first man to lead his country. And so he recognized and acknowledged that there were going to be precedents that he would put in place that subsequent presidents would in fact follow. And so even the littlest of things would in fact could be quite large for the future. Washington said it this way: many things which appear of little importance in themselves and at the beginning may have great and durable consequences for their having been established at the commencement of a new general government. Washington understood the significance of being first, and so he is going to conduct himself with integrity and honor, and he's going to be very careful in regard to the steps that he takes, for he understood that they would have long-term consequences. Washington will be sworn in as President of the United States, and after being sworn in, he will step inside and deliver an inaugural address to both houses of the Congress. This is a precedent that other presidents will in fact follow. Washington's inaugural address was in fact quite brief. It was a mere 7 paragraphs. This is not a precedent that other presidents will follow. There are some who have delivered very long, very windy addresses. Nonetheless, it's Washington that establishes the precedent for a brevity. Washington, I might add, he really, we avoided a painful precedent. For example, Washington was given a 73-page inaugural address. It was ghost-written. It was given to him, and he sat down at his desk at Mount Vernon and attempted to read through this document. And it was a very painful process for Washington, and he recognized that it was going to be very painful for those assembled as well. He discarded the 73-page inaugural address and chose to read his 7 paragraphs. Washington will read the 7 paragraphs. Onlookers will be amazed. He will read it. It will be very slow. You need to note that Washington was not a public speaker, was very uncomfortable in these public sorts of situations. One senator from Pennsylvania stated that he seemed to be more embarrassed by this situation than he was cannon fire. Washington will lay out in very broad terms the themes of his administration. This is a precedent. He will also avoid talking about policy. He'll avoid making recommendations to the Congress. He will recall his preference for remaining in retirement. Washington wanted to, after serving as the Revolutionary War commander, simply wanted to remain at Mount Vernon in a state of retirement. Washington will confess his own shortcomings. He will express his gratitude to his countrymen for choosing him for such a lofty position. He will pay homage to the Lord God Almighty. So in Washington, what we see is, by looking at his inaugural address specifically, we see an office holder who was reluctant to serve. We see a politician who was above partisan politics, and we see a Virginian who is not for simply his state of Virginia. He is for the entire nation. He is looking after or looking out for the entire nation. He is thinking of the United States as, in fact, a country. Later presidents will attempt to do this. I mean, no one else could, but later presidents will attempt to do this. They'll attempt to convince the American people that they are above partisan politics, that they were a reluctant office holder, and they had in fact been drafted for this job, and that they had no personal self-interest in being president of the United States. I mean, other presidents will in fact try to follow this lead that Washington had set forth, but none are able to do it. I mean, after all, there is only one father of our country. Washington will face or encounter multiple challenges during his first term in office. The first of those challenges is relating to the public. Now, you may dismiss this and say, relating to the public, how goofy. Well, the fact of the matter is this is very, very important. In the 18th century, people were accustomed to kings, and they were accustomed to military dictators. I mean, this was in fact a new office. So how do you conduct oneself? What Washington will do is he's going to look back upon his own experience. And his own experience, his own background was that of a military commander. And so he's going to carry himself in the office as if he is simply a military commander. And you can see it in his dress. Very, very lavish, always adorned with a sword. He will have dinner parties. There will be tea parties that will be conducted. Actually, he'll have something that he referred to as visits of compliment. Twice a week, people could come out for 1 hour and meet with the President of the United States. There would be no handshaking during these visits of compliments. When you would greet the President, you would greet him with a very stiff bow. Washington will conduct himself with dignity. He will conduct himself with honor. And he's going to be very careful to always maintain the dignity of the office. And so he will, as he travels throughout the city as President of the United States, he will have a very fine coach. That coach will be drawn by 6 horses. Washington will have a household staff. Some of the household members that will serve him as President of the United States will be from his plantation at Mount Vernon, which included a couple of slaves. Washington made very few personal appearances. He did not attend funerals. He did not attend weddings. The fact of the matter is, he's not a public person. He did not like giving public addresses. And he just, I mean, he's very different if you compare him to, say, 20th or 21st century presidents. The fact of the matter is, most people never saw their president. First Lady. Martha Washington will be America's First Lady. This term First Lady, though, was not coined until several decades after Washington had served. She is going to have limited social functions. And I might note that Martha Washington was, in fact, very uncomfortable with the entire situation. She was uncomfortable being the wife of the first president of the United States, and she was uncomfortable in carrying out her social duties. Martha Washington put it this way: I live a very dull life, and know nothing that passes in the town. I never go to any public place. Indeed, I think I am more like a state prisoner than anything else. There are certain bounds set for me which I must not depart from, and I cannot do as I like. I am obstinate and stay at home a great deal. Martha Washington really was very uncomfortable in this position as First Lady. And she was much more comfortable simply and much happier just simply being at home. Now, it's going to fall on Washington to establish or to set up this new government. The fact of the matter is, yes, you have a written constitution, but at the time it was simply a piece of paper. So we're going to have to establish or set up a government from scratch. The three executive departments will be created: departments of state, the departments of the Treasury, the departments of war. And these things are going to be put into place. There's going to be an attorney general. There will be the post of postmaster general, and there will be the United States Supreme Court. At the time, the United States Supreme Court will have six justices who will serve. The new government will have a very limited budget, a very, very small, and there will be some political positions that will need to be occupied. The government in 1789 is not nearly the size that it is today, and there weren't all of these positions that had to be filled by the President of the United States, but there will be some, and Washington will express a displeasure in spending his time moving through the mounds of applicants to select the right person for each and every slot that was available. Now, Washington, he believed in a government by the respected upper class. I mean, he didn't believe in a government really by lower class or working class people. He believed in a government of the upper class, people like Thomas Jefferson. And so that notion is reflected in his cabinet. He chose two people that really are the crown princes of his administration. He will choose for Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and he will choose for Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. In these guys, you can see Washington's attempt to establish some sort of balance within his cabinet. He chose, in other words, he tried to balance it along geographical and ideological lines, and you can actually see both of those points in Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton was from New York. Jefferson was from the South. He was from Virginia. Ideologically speaking, these two were miles apart. Hamilton believed in a very strong central government. Hamilton was very, very much pro-English. He was, in other words, he was an Anglophile. He believed that the United States Constitution was flexible. Okay? It could be manipulated, if you will. That certain portions were simply open to interpretation. Jefferson, on the other hand, was diametrically opposed ideologically to Alexander Hamilton. Jefferson believed in a limited government, a very small government. He was a Francophile. He loved French culture. He read the Constitution, as it was written. In other words, he's a strict constructionist. He believed that the founders meant what they said, and said what they meant, in expressing it in this document. And he did not believe that it was open to interpretation. And so these two guys are going to be diametrically opposed. to one another on ideological lines. And so therefore, you're going to have these clashes of views expressed in cabinet meetings, and it will be Washington who will ultimately have the decision as to which way the administration will move. And in many cases, it will be based on who made the better argument. Okay, who of Jefferson and Hamilton, who made the better argument? More often than not, Washington will side with Alexander Hamilton. Washington will establish a number of other precedents. He will establish the process of appointing or making temporary appointments. Making these temporary appointments without consenting Congress. He will also establish the precedent of not intervening in congressional business or congressional matters. Washington will, in fact, make suggestions to Congress. He made a suggestion to Congress that they appropriate funds to build an army. But he himself did not intervene directly. He was not a lobbyist. But he will leave that duty up to Hamilton and Jefferson. Hamilton and Jefferson will work the halls of Congress. And Hamilton especially will make the president's desires known to members of Congress. And so when Hamilton was in the halls of Congress manipulating, it was understood that he was working on behalf of the President of the United States. Washington will establish other precedents as well. President Washington will distance himself from the United States Senate. If you have ever read the United States Constitution, you will note that the president is permitted to engage in negotiating of treaties with the advice and consent of the United States Senate. Washington will propose a treaty with the Creek Indian tribe, Indian nation. He will go before the United States Senate in 1789 to propose this treaty. Now, the atmosphere inside the United States Senate was not all that delightful for Washington. It was very loud. It was smoke-filled. People brought their dogs in. It was not an enjoyable atmosphere for Washington. And he had to suffer the indignity of sitting in this environment and listening to the treaty that he had proposed and supported go through 2 readings. After it went through 2 readings, it was not approved. It was quickly referred to a standing committee for further discussion and further debate. This outraged Washington. He thought that it was incredibly disrespectful. He stormed out of the Senate chamber and stated, "This defeats every purpose of my coming here." This will establish another precedent for President Washington. He will not go before the United States Senate again. He will consult with his staff when it came to domestic issues and when it came to foreign affairs. He'll rally around his very capable cabinet to discuss these issues, and he will not consult or solicit the advice of the United States Senate. That, in fact, will establish another precedent. Washington will be very, very reluctant to use the veto pen. The President of the United States does have the power to veto bills, veto legislation. Washington does not use the veto power until 1792. So it should be noted that the President was very, very reluctant to veto bills. Congress is generally going to be very deferential towards Washington's appointments. For example, people that Washington will appoint to specific posts, say a justice of the United States Supreme Court. That sort of position requires the consent of Congress, and they're going to be pretty much deferential towards his appointments and will approve them. While that does establish a precedent, it nonetheless is not always adhered to. So keep that in mind. Washington will establish himself as the head of the executive branch. It's very, very clear that Washington was a very strong president, and he will establish himself as the head of the executive branch. And see, this was not at all clear in 1789, 1790. There were those that believed that the president and the Congress should in fact share power, but it will be Washington who will set himself up as the clear head of the executive branch. This is a precedent that has long-term consequences, and it was established by President Washington. Today, I conclude and leave you with this question. What were the key precedents that George Washington set for future presidents? Thank you very much, and enjoy life.